Open your Bibles to Genesis 49. We'll start with verse 1. Before I go to verse 1, well, let's just read verse 1. And Jacob called unto his sons. This is where Jacob gives a blessing to all his sons. And Jacob called unto his sons and said, Gather yourselves together, that I might tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Or in the last of days, or the latter time. The last days is a good translation. And of course he goes one by one, giving blessings and foretelling what they are to expect. And of course if you read some of these, you have no clue what that really means. And of course commentators have been trying to figure it out, or they think they have figured it out, and they express their opinion in commentary form, which, when it comes to especially Joseph, makes no sense at all. I'll read you a few examples. Before I even do that, before I get on with tonight's teaching on Genesis 49, you see articles by the Atlantic. Well, an author of an article that was posted originally on Atlantic just a day or two ago, and more people are talking about ISIS or ISIL. And we're acting surprised that they mean business, at least in this country. Our administration, our government doesn't even want to accept it as an Islamic, let's just call it an Islamic radical jihad. They refuse to put the title of any of the Islamic wording behind all these things that you're seeing and hearing. Some of it are atrocities that are unbelievable, burning people alive, beheading people, slashing their throats. You think it was ironic? They took 21 Coptic Christians to the shores of Tripoli, Libya. That was a message to the United States, folks. I'm not going to get into the history why that it is tonight, but that was a message to the United States. They want the confrontation. And I'm so tired of hearing, I think our administration purposely puts out these low numbers to not frighten people, or whatever the reason is. I'm sure there's more than one. But the ISIS army, or the ISIL army, is not 21 to 30,000 strong. Even with their recent deaths, they're growing. They're attracting more and more people. A conservative number now is 150,000 strong. And that's conservative. And not just all dedicated to one area, Syria and Iraq. I wouldn't be surprised that number grows larger and larger in the next few months. But it's all part of a plan. The news media is acting surprised. They're in shock if they cover it. The USA government administration is in denial. The rest of the world don't know what to do with the problem. The problem's here. And eventually it's going to be dealt with. that Arab confederacy is developing around Little Satan, or what they consider the nation of Israel in the Middle East. And it's going to draw us in too. It already has to a certain extent. Air raids are not going to be sufficient. Anybody that even thinks that, you should go apply for a job at the White House, because you're right up their alley in the way of thinking. But this has been part of a 7-step plan that was first disclosed back in 1996 by Al-Qaeda leaders. And they actually had a sit-down with their Jordanian journalist to lay out their 7-step plan. 1996, that's before 9/11. That's before the Gulf War. That's before Afghanistan. That's before the Iraqi War. That's before the nonsense of Arab Spring. It's for all that. 1996. That's 19 years ago, folks. And they let a 7-step plan. Al-Qaeda. And ISIS is just an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. And they laid out their plan in phases. I'm going to read you the different phases before I go into Genesis 49 tonight to see if any of this sounds familiar. Their first phase, starting in the year 2000 to 2003. According to their plan, it is known as the Awakening. This has already been carried out, and it was supposed to have lasted from 2000 to 2003. More precisely, from September 11th, the attacks on September 11th in New York City and Washington, to the fall, listen closely, to the fall of Baghdad in 2003. That's right. Al-Qaeda's plan, overall plan, and their hope was our reaction to what happened on September 11th, 2001, which would drive us to Afghanistan and eventually to Iraq. The aim of the attacks of 9/11 was to provoke the U.S. into declaring war on the Islamic world, and thereby awakening Muslims. That's why it's called the Awakening phase of the plan. The first phase was judged by the strategists as masterminds behind Al-Qaeda as very successful. Looking back, they're right. The battlefield was opened up, and the Americans and their allies became a closer and easier target. They want us to be sucked into that area. They have a apocalyptic point of view that if they bring down the little and great Satan, the world would turn Islamic. The terrorist network is also reported as being satisfied that its message can now be heard everywhere. And that's exactly what happened. Before 9/11, 2001, you didn't hear, even with the World Trade Center bombings back, I think it was in 1993, it was not a common thought. It was not dinner conversation where you would have someone over a cup of coffee, even talk about what's happening in the Middle East with these jihad that's going on. Nobody even heard of anything like that. Now let's move on to the second phase, which is between 2003 and 2006. It's called the opening eyes phase. So you have the awakening, now you have the opening eyes. This is the period that would last from 2003 to 2006. This is what they were hoping to gain. Terrorists hoped to make the Western conspiracy aware of the Islamic community. Well, they sure did that. This is a phase in which Al-Qaeda wants an organization to develop into a movement. The network is banking on recruiting young men during this period. Iraq should become the center of all global operations, with an army set up there and bases established in other Arabic states. We're there now. Let's move on to the third phase. This third phase is called a rise and standing up phase. It's from 2007 to 2010. This is what their 7-step plan that they laid out, I repeat, back in 1996, and they're pretty close to fulfilling their dreams and the plans that they laid out and what they wanted to accomplish. Now in 2007 and 2010, how come we're not hearing about this anywhere? Because every government almost in this world is in some sort of denial, some stage of it, and don't want to accept that these terrorists, these jihadists, these Islamic eighth beast jihadists are on track, and they mean business in achieving their goals. The rise and standing up should be from approximately 2007 to 2010. There will be a focus on Syria. The fighting supposedly would start taking place somewhere in the Iraqi area. Attacks on Turkey and even more explosive in Israel are predicted, but not certain. Al-Qaeda's mastermind hoped that attacks on Israel help the terrorist groups become a recognized organization. Quite not there yet. The author also believes that countries neighboring Iraq, such as Jordan, are also in danger. Let's move on to the fourth phase, which is 2010 to 2013. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates will aim to bring about the collapse of the hated Arabic governments. Libya. They tried with Egypt. You see Yemen. You see Syria. Assad's still in power, but not much. Probably longer. Who knows? They're going to aim for Jordan. They definitely want Iraq. So they're hated the collapse of the hated Arabic governments, such as Mubarak, was temporarily successful. But then Egyptian military commanders took it back, temporarily at least. We'll see what happens with that. The estimate is that the creeping loss of the regime's power will lead to a steady growth in strength with Al-Qaeda. The weaker these governments, these Arabic governments become, the stronger the Al-Qaeda and its affiliates will become. At the same time, the attacks will be carried out against oil suppliers, and the U.S. economy will be targeted using cyber terrorism. We just heard about that recently, that ISIS was successful to a certain degree using cyber terrorism. That ain't the first time. We're just now hearing about it. That's an unfortunate part about it. It's like they're trying to keep us in the dark. For those of you that don't research this stuff out on a daily basis and keep abreast what's going on, it's hard to come by. Let's move on to the fifth phase. This phase will be somewhere between 2013 and 2016, the events that will take place in that phase, the fifth phase. This will be the point at which the Islamic State or Caliphate can be declared. Well, that's been done. The plan is that by this time, between 2013 and 2016, Western influence in the Islamic world will be so reduced and Israel weakened so much that resistance will not be feared. Well, Israel was not weakened that much, but the Western influence was weakened by an administration in this country that started its apology tour when President Obama took office to the Islam world of the Middle East. From that point on, from that moment on, they saw a weak president. They saw a confused president, a president that has no clue, an administration that supports him that has probably even less of a clue than he does. Al-Qaeda hopes that by then the Islamic State will be able to bring about a new world order. The sixth phase, 2016 to 2020. This is the phase called the total confrontation phase. As soon as the caliphate has been declared the Islamic army, it will instigate the fight between the believers and the non-believers, which has so often been predicted by Osama bin Laden. The seventh phase, 2020 and beyond. This final stage is described as a definite victory phase. In the terrorists' eyes, because the rest of the world will be so beaten down by the 1.5 billion Muslims, the caliphate would undoubtedly succeed. This phase should be completed by 2020, although the war shouldn't last longer than 2 years. That's enough on that. They had a 7-step plan all figured out back in 1996, and most of their plans up to 2015 has been spot on. We better take it seriously. What they're intending to do if you're a non-believer in Jesus Christ. But if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, I believe this is Christ's hand on history, past, present, and the future, allowing certain things to happen, including the administration we have in the office today, to put us in a weakened state because our enemies do not fear us. Oh, they will. I doubt it with this administration, but they will. They will. God has a say, not just what Israel will do and how it will react, but also the United States of America, which I have said over and over, I believe is Ephraim. Now, let's go to Genesis 49. And Jacob called unto his sons and said, verse 1, gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Not their last days of their life, but the last days, a latter time. The Hebrew is very clear, of a future event. And like I said, he goes one by one through the sons, and he gets to verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. But his bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. God there is added by the translations, by the way. The mighty of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Even by the God of the Father, even by the God of thy father, who shall help thee, and by the Almighty, who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lie under the blessings of the breast and of the womb. The blessings of thy father have prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors unto the utmost bound of everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him that was separated from his brethren. End of, I believe, is a prophecy. But let's just look at the first verse first. Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. Let me read you what some commentators. Oh, well, let's include verse 23 also. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. Let me read you what some commentators, and they're pretty much a good sample of what just about all of them say. Joseph is a fruitful bough. This is more of an accounting of his life and personal blessing. In a sense, Joseph's tribe is already blessed when his sons receive their blessing. That's it. Verse 23, the archers have bitterly grieved him. Though Joseph was shot at and hated, he was still a fruitful bough. This is because the arms of his hands are made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. The idea is that God's hands were on Joseph's hands, giving him strength and skill to work the bough expertly. God was there even when Joseph did not know it. If you put a latter time frame on it, what does that really do for you? More super spiritual. I don't know what this means, so I'll just write something that sounds good. Or write something that would just keep on confusing the subject matter that is not understood by probably anyone anyway. I'll give you another example. The sum of the fruitful vine. This appears to me to refer to Jacob himself, who was blessed with such a numerous prosperity that in 215 years after his own descendants amount to upward of 600,000 effective men. And the figures here are intended to point out the continual growth and increase of his prosperity. I do agree with that to a certain extent, but that's not what this prophet is really referring to only. Jacob was a fruitful tree planted by a fountain, which because it was good would yield good fruit, and because it was planted near a fountain, from being continually watered, would be perpetually fruitful. Okay? Put here for branches shoot over or run upon the wall, alluding probably to this case of the vine, which requires to be supported by a wall, trees, etc. What does that do for you? I asked the same question over again. The chief archers, what does that mean? Joseph's brethren who either used such weapons while feeding their flocks in the deserts for the protection of themselves and cattle, or for the purpose of hunting, and who probably excelled in archery. It may, however, refer to the bitter speeches and harsh words that they spoke to him and of him, for they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Thus they sorely afflicted him and were instantly scolded or finding fault. Hello! Why are you going back to what happened to Joseph and his brothers when it says in verse 1, let me tell you what shall befall you in the last days? Give you another example. Joseph is a fruitful bough, or as one like the bough or branch of a tree laden with fruit, as he was with children, one of which he called Ephraim from his fruitfulness. And both his sons became numerous in the heads of 2 tribes in Israel, and with other temporal fruits and blessings as riches and honor, and especially with the fruits of grace and righteousness. Even a fruitful bough by a well. Those are the most fruitful that are near a well or fountain of water, as such trees are which are planted by the rivers of water. See Psalms 1:3. Don't even go there. This being repeated may have respect for the 2 boughs or branches of Joseph's family, or the 2 fruitful and numerous tribes that sprung up from him, concerning whose branches run over the wall. As such trees that are set against one, and by the reflected heat of the sun grow the more and become more fruitful. The word for branches is daughters, which some refer to daughters of Manasseh, who received their inheritance on both sides of Jordan, and others interpreted of the cities of the tribes of Ephraim, as cities are sometimes called. I repeat, does that do anything for you? Does these prophecies about and blessings and concerning what Jacob prophesied in the latter days do anything for you? Does it explain anything? Does it fill in the gaps? Doesn't make any sense. So what does? Joseph is a fruitful bough. Even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. This is a latter time event. This is something that's happened within the last 100 years, if you know your history. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. What archers? Can we be a little bit more specific? Or do you wish that I continue the mumbo jumbo I just read to you that makes no total sense concerning what was prophesied concerning Joseph, the son of Jacob, and his offsprings, Ephraim and Manasseh? Go to the board. Write this down. Joseph, let him add a nation that branched off by a fountain, in parentheses, an eye of the landscape. I'll explain that in a minute. A company to march over or above the wall. Write that down and keep it on there. You don't need to look at me. Keep it on there. Joseph, let him add, is what Joseph's name means. So Joseph is being told that Joseph, a nation that will branch off by a fountain, or you will have a nation that will branch off by a fountain. A fountain in Hebrew is always like an eye of the landscape. By definition, that's why you see it there in parentheses. So Joseph, a nation that branch off by a fountain, a company to march over or above the wall. Well, that sounds like a riddle. Despite being 239 years old, the USA is the third most populous nation on this planet, only behind ancient nations that's been around a long, long time, such as China and India, that have had literally millennia longer to build their country and population. The translation of Joseph is a fruitful bough is not a good one. It should have been Joseph, a nation that branched off. Now, everyone knows that even if you go back to the Middle East ancient nation of Israel, it is clear, and it's a fact, that Joseph's branches, Ephraim and Manasseh, would not be contained within Israel's boundaries or geographical territory they were assigned to. That has been fulfilled, period. No doubt about it. No one really can argue that. And once the Assyrian Empire came in and Ephraim was taken into bondage, they never returned. The house of Israel never returned and stayed in Israel. In one way of looking at this prophecy, they did stay outside that wall. But that's not what this verse is referring to. Prophecies, and I've said this many times, have multiple fulfillments. So we have to keep looking for fulfillments over the course of history, looking at history. I have said that over and over to you. God's using these nations as chess, like a chess game. We're chess pieces. We're nations. And He knows what He's doing. And we really couldn't understand this verse until we come to a time period in history close to the 1948 date, when many things started to be revealed to us and God's Word started unfolding itself to be made known at the right time. And I've said this. Before, Ephraim, United States of America, and during World War II, they really would not want to participate in that war whatsoever. Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, the president at that time, I believe, in a different way, was like-minded, similar to a Socialist Party agenda. He didn't look too unfavorably, in my opinion, what was happening in Europe. The USA would not entered World War II, and I believe the Jews probably would have been annihilated. However, guess who's in charge? God's in charge. I believe God allowed the Japanese. There's no good sense of why the Japanese would attack the United States. I've read all the history. I've seen all the justifications. It just didn't make sense at that time because we're so reluctant to enter any war at that particular period. We were just coming out of another depression. Why get into a war? But God allowed the Japanese army to bomb Pearl Harbor, I believe, in order to draw the USA into World War II, and would eventually not only defeat the Japanese in the Pacific, but march on to Europe and crush Hitler and the Nazis, who were crushing the Jews. It's amazing when you look back at the history of World War II. The only nation that Adolf Hitler declared war on, if you guess Ephraim or the US of A, you guess right. And I have said before, Hitler was Little Horn. If you missed that part of the Last Day series, go back. You could read it or find the video. It's in one of the earlier volumes or it's one of the earlier videos in the Last Day series. I believe there's like 220 videos up right now in the Last Day series. There's plenty to go through. But I don't want to get into too much of the history of World War II and what was in Hitler's mind at the time. I do want to speak concerning this verse. I want to preach on this verse and why it's important to understand what would happen in a latter time. Now come back, well, no, keep it on the board still. Joseph, scratch out a fruitful bough. Joseph, a nation that branched off by a well or a fountain whose branches run over the wall. I'll get to the fountain hopefully by the end of it tonight, if not at least by maybe Sunday evening. Now, I want to concentrate, remember it's the latter time event, on the latter part of this verse. A company to march over or above, either way is fine, the wall. What wall? Ephraim is mighty bow. Ephraim is mighty strength given to them by God. Prophesied by God in other books of the Bible, would come to the rescue of the house of Judah that was in Europe, that Hitler was trying to eliminate. We were reluctant at first, but once and I know the European nations, such as the United Kingdom, they would have failed without us. Even though Churchill was spirited, and he tried to rally his nation behind him, which he did to a certain extent, they still would have failed. They needed the mighty strength of Ephraim. So Ephraim who bow abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Now, looking at the latter part of this verse, a company to march over or above the wall. What does that mean? Well, Joseph, or let him add, a nation. The nation would be eventually the USA. That's what you see here in the Bible. That branched off from Europe and became a nation in 1776 when it declared its independence. I will get that branched off by a fountain period in a minute, but a company to march over above the wall. So this latter day event tells of a nation that would branch off from the rest of the tribes and would be found by a fountain, an eye of the landscape, a company to march over eventually or above the wall. Not only be found because it left, but it would go back and come to the aid of his brethren. Now, anybody, come back to me now. Everybody's heard of the invasion of Normandy. Operation Overlord, it's called. Or the D-Day. You've heard of that. Well, let me read you something. And get those pictures ready. And I'll tell you when to put them up. During World War II, 1939 to 1945, the Battle of Normandy, I'm just going to read you a little bit of history. There's a lot of history in World War II, but I'm just going to read you a little bit. I don't want to bore you to death. During World War II, the Battle of Normandy, which lasted from June 1944 to August 1944, resulted in the Allied liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany control. Codename Operation Overlord, the battle began on June 6, 1944, also known as D-Day, when some 156,000 American, British, and Canadian forces landed on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the heavily fortified coast of France's Normandy region. Wow. So 156,000 American, British, and Canadian forces landed on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of heavily fortified France Normandy region. The invasion was one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history and required extensive planning. Prior to D-Day, the Allies conducted a large-scale deception campaign designed to mislead the Germans about the intended invasion target. By late August 1944, all of northern France had been liberated, and by the following spring, the Allies had defeated the Germans. The Normandy landings have been called the beginning of the end of war in Europe. Now, preparing for D-Day, After World War II began, Germany invaded and occupied northwestern France, beginning in 1940. The Americans entered the war in December 1941. And by 1942, they and the British were considering the possibility of a major Allied invasion across the English Channel. The following year, Allied plans for a cross-channel invasion began to ramp up. In November 1943, Adolf Hitler, who was aware of the threat of invasion along France's northern coast, put Erwin Rommel in charge of spearheading defense operations in the region. Even though the Germans did not know exactly where the Allies would strike, Hitler charged Rommel with finishing the Atlantic Wall. This Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile fortification of bunkers, landmines, and beach and water obstacles, stretching 2,400 miles. Put the first picture up. For the success of the invasion, they would have to go through, this Atlantic Wall. You can't see the whole picture there, but I'll read you from left to right. It reads the Belgium Gates. The first thing, once they landed on the shore, they had to get past through the Belgian Gates. 10-foot-high steel frame structures were set parallel to the beach. Anti-tank mines were attached to the top. You get through that, then you got the teller mines. These are on posts angled seaward, covered at high tide and placed 200 yards from shore. You get through that, then you had to deal with the ramps, which were mine-tipped logs were driven into the sand. Now the fourth one over, the hedgehogs. Those were mine-tipped 6-foot-high obstacles constructed of steel rails welded together to rip the bottom out of landing craft at high tide. Then you get the walls of barbed wire and minefields, crisscross the beaches and paths leading off the beaches. Then up on the first horizon there, you see the pillboxes. These were small concrete bunkers, shielded machine guns, nests, and anti-tank guns. And of course, on high cliffs, hundreds of feet tall, the last obstacle of this wall, which was the concrete bunkers. Steel reinforced concrete protected 75 and 88 millimeter guns. This was considered the Atlantic Wall. And some places was more fortified than others, but it stretched 2,400 miles. What would Joseph's descendants have to do? What would that nation that branched off by a fountain would have to do? It would have to send a company to march over or above the wall. So the two sticks can join, as Ezekiel say, and start another prophecy that would set the clock ticking forward on future events. But first, they had to get through this wall. Let me continue. In January 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower was appointed commander of Operation Overlord. Leave that wall up there for just a few more minutes while I'm reading. In the months and weeks before D-Day, the Allies carried out a massive deception operation intended to make the Germans think the main invasion target was the narrowest point between Britain and France, was Pas de Calais, I think it's pronounced, but I might be off in that pronunciation. So this was the narrowest point between British and France, rather than Normandy. In addition, they led the Germans to believe that Norway and other locations were also potential invasion targets. By the way, let's put on the next picture. I think that shows you the stretch of wall, how far it went through the different nations. There you go, the Atlantic Wall between 1992 and 1944. There's a Hitler's Atlantic Wall. You see the wall in yellow there. Green right there is the British Isles. But you see it stretching from the southern border of France all the way through the coastline up to Norway and then eventually into Finland. That was considered the Atlantic Wall, which the company had to march over above to achieve the freedom and the liberation of people that still survived the Holocaust, their fellow brethren, and all the related house of Joseph tribal families that can be traced back all the way to the Celts. Now, where was I? Okay. In addition, they led the Germans to believe that Norway and other locations were also potential invasion targets. Many tactics was used to carry out the deception, including fake equipment, a Fathom army commanded by George Patton, supposedly based in England, across from Poste Calais, double agents, and fraudulent radio transmissions. And then there was a weather delay in June 5, 1944. Eisenhower selected June 5, 1944 as a date for the invasion. However, bad weather in the days leading up to the operation caused it to be delayed for 24 hours. What's the next picture, by the way? I don't remember the sequence of pictures. No, take that back. Go back to the other one. Okay, leave it there. I'm going to get to that fountain in a minute. Later that day, more than 5,000 ships and landing craft carrying troops and supplies left England for their trip across the Channel to France, while more than 11,000 aircraft were mobilized to provide air cover and support for the invasion. D-Day landings, June 6, 1944. The first wave of the attack began with the paratroopers. These were men who jumped out of the planes using parachutes. They jumped at night in the pitch dark and landed behind enemy lines. Their job was to destroy key targets and capture bridges in order for the main invasion force to land on the beach. Thousands of dummies were also dropped in order to draw fire and confuse the enemy. In the next stage of the battle, thousands of planes dropped bombs on German defenses. Soon after, warships began to bomb the beaches from the water. While the bombing was going on, underground members of the French resistance sabotaged the Germans by cutting telephone lines and destroying railroads. The amphibious invasion began at 6:30 a.m. The British and Canadians overcame light opposition to carry beaches codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword, as the Americans at Utah Beach. U.S. forces faced heavy resistance at Omaha Beach, where there were over 2,000 American casualties. However, by the day's end, approximately 156,000 Allied troops had successfully stormed Normandy's beaches. According to some estimates, more than 4,000 Allied troops lost their lives in D-Day invasion, with thousands more wounded or missing. Less than a week later, on June 11th, the beaches were fully secured and over 326,000 troops, more than 50,000 vehicles, and some 100,000 tons of equipment had landed at Normandy. They pierced that wall. For their part, the Germans suffered from a confusion in their ranks and the absence of celebrated Commander Rommel, who was away on leave. At first, Hitler believing the invasion was a feint designed to distract the Germans from coming attack north of Seine River, refused to release nearby divisions that joined the counterattack. Reinforcements had to be called from further afield, causing delays. He also hesitated in calling for more armored divisions to help in their defense. Moreover, the Germans were hampered by effective Allied air support, which took out many key bridges and forced the Germans to take long detours, as well as the efficient Allied naval support, which helped protect advancing Allied troops. In the ensuing weeks, the Allies fought their way across Normandy countryside in the face of determined German resistance, as well as a dense landscape of marshes and hedgerows. By the end of June, the Allies had seized the vital port of Cherbourg, landed approximately 850,000 men and 150,000 vehicles in Normandy, and were poised to continue their march across France. By the end of August 1944, the Allies had reached the Seine River. Paris was liberated, and the Germans had been removed from northwestern France, effectively concluding the Battle of Normandy. The Allied forces then prepared to enter Germany, where they would meet up with Soviet troops moving in from the east. The Normandy invasion began to turn the tide against the Nazis. A significant psychological blow, it also prevented Hitler from sending troops from France to build up his eastern front against the advancing Soviets. The following spring, on May 8, 1945, the Allies formally accepted the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. Hitler had committed suicide a week earlier, on April 30th. The overall military operation was called Operation Overlord. The actual landings at Normandy were called Operation Neptune. Now, that's the landing of Normandy, called the invasion of Normandy or the Operation Overlord. You come back to me now. That's the first stage of this prophecy. I always told you, you have to look at history to see if you can find somewhere in God's Word that points to the event. And once you understand what the language, when it's broken down, what it does mean, not what the translators in the King James and other translations try to make it poetically meaningful. And of course, most of these translations were prior to these events happening, especially the King James. They didn't have a clue. So they did their best, because why? According to Daniel, these things will be hidden until it was a time to be made known. Joseph, let him add. What he's going to add? Eventually, a nation that branched off by a fountain. Go to the next picture. Where is that nation that branched off by a fountain? A fountain in the Hebrew was considered an eye of a landscape. The eye of a certain landscape. Well, there's a fountain. The world's most famous fountain. The world's tallest geyser. Now there's an eye of the landscape. Everybody knows Old Faithful. That's the geyser that so reliable 19th century explorers dub it eternity's timepiece. But this one you see in there in the picture, and you can rotate between the three pictures. That name is Steamboat. Old Faithful's embarrassing, erratic brother that periodically blows, as you see there in these pictures. Not too long ago, was dormant for 8 years. This geyser or fountain reaches up to 300 to 400 feet, and it's considered the world's tallest active geyser. And of course, what I'm reading here, it says that since it's the tallest active geyser, it has a tendency to either overwhelm its fans or, as has been the case of late, keep them waiting for years, like I just told you. The last time it blew, or one of the last times it blew, was like an amazing experience. One person wrote, it sounded like a locomotive. Everybody was frantic. Everybody started taking pictures. People were running down trying to get to it before it went away because it's so erratic. Now, geysers or fountains are a rare formation, with more than half of the world's total. Guess where they call home? Yellowstone Park, here in the USA. Joseph would have its population increased. Ephraim would become strong and mighty. A nation that branched off. Where? By a fountain. By a fountain. That eye of a landscape. The world's tallest geyser. If you're looking for clues, look no further. You think that's a coincidence? I don't think it's a coincidence. You can stop it now and come back to me. In fact, go back to the board. Joseph, a nation that branched off by a fountain. Hello? Not just any fountain. The world's tallest fountain. A definite eye of the landscape type fountain. And it would put together a company to march over and above the wall. Over and above the wall. What wall? There's only one wall in history, in our history. When you put all the pieces together, it points to the one we marched over or above, the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's Atlantic Wall. And the prophecy takes a turn. Not much of a turn, because Hitler and Islamists, the eighth beast, have a lot in common. And the very next verse says, the archers have sorely grieved him, and shot at him, and hated him. It's amazing how people that put dictionaries, whether Hebrew or Greek or lexicons together, how some try to change the Hebrew to fit their definition. Now some haven't, thank God, but some have. They try to change that word archers where it means something totally different. But right there, Baal, B-A-A-L, coming from Baal. I want to read you something, what this word means. The Baal, let's call it that. Let's see if I still have it here. What does this word mean in the Hebrew? It often refers to a Canaanite deity because Baal comes from Baal. That's the root Baal. And it often refers to the Canaanite deity, generally known as Baal in the Old Testament and other local manifestations. Worship of this deity seems to have been common in the northern kingdom, which is attested in the preponderance of the Baal theophoric element in many proper nouns. The Lord may also have been referred to with this generic term for Lord, but in light of the worship of Baal in the north. So it was a word that would use what affected eventually the northern kingdom, the house of Joseph. And not only that, it was considered, because of its association with the root word that it comes from, to be a Canaanite deity. In other words, moon god. If you follow this teaching from the beginning, Baal is nothing more than the moon god and the Canaanite deities that were established to be worshipped. The Baal have sorely grieved thee. This is a prophecy given by Jacob millenniums ago. For a latter day. Our thorn of flesh is not Russia. Our thorn of flesh is not North Korea. Our thorn of flesh is the moon god. It's the eighth beast. I'm going to write down, because I didn't have time, I'm going to write down how this verse should read in the Hebrew. Not the way the translators wrote it. The Baal, to be bitter, they sure are, and shoot and lay snares. I started this program, this teaching session of the program tonight, by reading you the 7-step plan that Al-Qaeda and its offshoots have laid out from 2000 to 2020 beyond, to lay snares to draw us in because they hate us so much, governed by their Allah, which is nothing more than a moon god that has made them bitter and full of hate. And by the way, the word there for that, sanctum, not Satan, S-A-N-T-A, if you would spell it out in the English, but sanctum. How ironic how close that is. S-A-T-A-M, M, not N. Now let's read his 2 verses, the way it should have been translated. Joseph, which means let him add, which he has. I told you about its population increase in such a short amount of time when it became a nation such as Ephraim, the USA, a nation that branched off by a fountain. Clearly, we have the landmarks to prove that. We have the eye of the landscape, the world's tallest geyser, steamboat, not to mention others in Yellowstone. A company to march over or above the wall. I'm giving you kind of word by word translations here, which I pointed out did happen in the latter days, like Jacob prophesied, to rescue, whether they realize it or not, the fellow brethren of the house of Joseph in Europe and the house of Judah. And second part of this prophecy at this point is the archers, no, the Baal, to be bitter and shoot and lay snares, hate. But that's why I don't look too much at the politics of what's happening. Come back to me now. Whether you're Republican or Democrat, whatever. Big whoop-dee waste of time. God's in control. He has put a bow, abode in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong. Who? The house of Joseph, in this case, the house of Ephraim, of Jacob, for thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. This nation was a nation that started by the pursuit of Jesus Christ, the stone of Israel. We have fallen by the wayside. And unfortunately, I believe probably something like 9/11 or better, or worse, will have to happen again to wake us up. Unfortunately. Something's going to come down, folks. But Ephraim will be in the fight. Because God, and many other different passages I don't have time to get to tonight, will put Ephraim there. Period. So play politics all you want. I'll look for God's word. I'll look in God's word for direction. And I know what's already declared. And the time is now to unravel the mystery of what these verses mean, not with all this poetic, feel-good stuff that makes no sense that I read to you at the beginning, but what actually, when you break down the language to the nitty-gritty of it and understand what it means, it is very clear. It's referring to the United States of America and what it would deal with in these last 100 years or so until the end. And it is very clear who our greatest enemy is. We just haven't recognized our enemy for who they are. You have to know your enemy to deal with your enemy. Well, God will have his wake-up call. Unfortunately, it probably has to be another disaster, is my guess. But when you wake up a sleeping tiger, beware. Because in God's hands, He always has the victory. Not the one that shoots and lays snares out of their hatred. Now, I'm just beginning on this. But I wanted to go back to these verses now and fill in more details. You have to look at history. You have to look at the language. And you got to clean the slate from all this nonsense that I read to you at the early part of this teaching tonight. And once you see the truth, all the pieces start fitting together. How ironic. God's in control. Now, that's all I'm going to say tonight. If you get it, play the song. I want to hear from you.